CHAPTER 15. Bennet Islet. The Halbrane was then within sight of Bennet Islet. The crew urgently needed rest, so the disembarkation was deferred until the following day, and I went back to my cabin. The night passed without disturbance, and when day came not a craft of any kind was visible on the waters, not a native on the beach. There were no huts upon the coast, no smoke arose in the distance to indicate that Bennet Islet was inhabited. But William Guy had not found any trace of human beings there, and what I saw of the islet answered to the description given by Arthur Pym. It rose upon a rocky base of about a league in circumference, and was so arid that no vegetation existed on its surface.
"Mr. Jeorling," said Captain Len Guy, "do you observe a promontory in the direction of the north-east?" "I observe it, captain." "Is it not formed of heaped-up rocks which look like giant bales of cotton?" "That is so, and just what the narrative describes." "Then all we have to do is to land on the promontory, Mr. Jeorling. Who knows but we may come across some vestige of the crew of the Jane, supposing them to have succeeded in escaping from Tsalal Island."
The speaker was devouring the islet with his eyes. What must his thoughts, his desires, his impatience have been? But there was a man whose gaze was set upon the same point even more fixedly. That man was Hunt. Before we left the Halbrane, Len Guy enjoined the most minute and careful watchfulness upon his lieutenant. This was a charge which West did not need. Our exploration would take only half a day at most. If the boat had not returned in the afternoon, a second was to be sent in search of us.
"Look sharp also after our recruits," added the captain.
"Don't be uneasy, captain," replied the lieutenant. "Indeed, since you want 4 men at the oars, you had better take them from among the new ones. That will leave 4 less troublesome fellows on board." This was a good idea, for, under the deplorable influence of Hearne, the discontent of his shipmates from the Falklands was on the increase. The boat being ready, 4 of the new crew took their places forward, while Hunt, at his own request, was steersman. Captain Len Guy, the boatswain, and myself, all well armed, seated ourselves aft, and we started for the northern point of the islet. In the course of an hour we had doubled the promontory and come out in sight of a little bay whose shores the boats of the Jane had touched. Hunt steered for this bay, gliding with remarkable skill between the rocky points which struck up here and there. One would have thought he knew his way among them. We disembarked on a stony coast. The stones were covered with sparse lichen. The tide was already ebbing, leaving uncovered the sandy bottom of a sort of beach strewn with black blocks, resembling big nail-heads. 2 men were left in charge of the boat while we landed amid the rocks, and, accompanied by the other 2, Captain Len Guy, the boatswain, Hunt, and I, proceeded towards the centre, where we found some rising ground from whence we could see the whole extent of the islet. But there was nothing to be seen on any side, absolutely nothing. On coming down from the slight eminence, Hunt went on in front, as it had been agreed that he was to be our guide. We followed him, therefore, as he led us towards the southern extremity of the islet. Having reached the point, Hunt looked carefully on all sides of him, then stooped and showed us a piece of half-rotten wood lying among the scattered stones.
"I remember,"
I exclaimed. "Arthur Pym speaks of a piece of wood with traces of carving on it which appeared to have belonged to the bow of a ship."
"Among the carving my brother fancied he could trace the design of a tortoise," added Captain Len Guy.
"Just so," I replied, "but Arthur Pym pronounced that resemblance doubtful. No matter, the piece of wood is still in the same place that is indicated in the narrative. So we may conclude that since the Jane cast anchor here, no other crew has set foot upon Bennet Islet. It follows that we should only lose time in looking out for any tokens of another landing. We shall know nothing until we reach Tsalal Island."
"Yes, Tsalal Island," replied the captain.
We then retraced our steps in the direction of the bay. In various places we observed fragments of coral reef, and bêche de mer was so abundant that our schooner might have taken a full cargo of it. Hunt walked on in silence, with downcast eyes, until, as we were close enough upon the beach to the east, he, being about 10 paces ahead, stopped abruptly, and summoned us to him by a hurried gesture. In an instant we were by his side. Hunt had evinced no surprise on the subject of the piece of wood first found, but his attitude changed when he knelt down in front of a worm-eaten plank lying on the sand. He felt it all over with his huge hands, as though he were seeking some tracery on its rough surface whose signification might be intelligible to him. The black paint was hidden under the thick dirt that had accumulated upon it. The plank had probably formed part of a ship's stern, as the boatswain requested us to observe.
Yes, yes, repeated Captain Len Guy. It made part of a stern.
Hunt, who still remained kneeling, nodded his big head in assent. But, I remarked, this plank must have been cast upon Bennet Islet from a wreck. The cross currents must have found it in the open sea, and
if that were so, cried the captain.
The same thought had occurred to both of us. What was our surprise, indeed, our amazement, our unspeakable emotion, when Hunt showed us 8 letters, cut in the plank, not painted, but hollow and distinctly traceable with the finger. It was only too easy to recognize the letters of 2 names arranged in 2 lines, thus: A.N. L.I.E.P.O.L. The Jane of the Liverpool, the schooner commanded by Captain William Guy. What did it matter that time had blurred the other letters? Did not those suffice to tell the name of the ship and the port she belonged to? The Jane of the Liverpool. Captain Len Guy had taken the plank in his hands, and now he pressed his lips to it, while tears fell from his eyes. It was a fragment of the Jane. I did not utter a word until the captain's emotion had subsided. As for Hunt, I had never seen such a lightning glance from his brilliant hawk-like eyes as he now cast towards the southern horizon. Captain Len Guy rose. Hunt, without a word, placed the plank on his shoulder, and we continued our route. When we had made the tour of the island, we halted at the place where the boat had been left under the charge of 2 sailors, and about 2:30 in the afternoon we were again on board. Early on in the morning of the 23rd of December, the Halbrane put off from Bennet Islet, and we carried away with us new and convincing testimony to the catastrophe which Tsalal Island had witnessed. During the day I observed the sea water very attentively, and it seemed to me less deeply blue than Arthur Pym describes it. Nor had we met a single specimen of his monster of the austral fauna, an animal 3 feet long, 6 inches high, with 4 short legs, long coral claws, a silky body, a rat's tail, a cat's head, the hanging ears, blood-red lips, and white teeth of a dog. The truth is that I regarded several of these details as suspect, and entirely due to an over-imaginative temperament. Seated far aft in the ship, I read Edgar Poe's book with sedulous attention, but I was not unaware of the fact that Hunt, whenever his duties furnished him with an opportunity, observed me pertinaciously and with looks of singular meaning. And in fact, I was reperusing the end of chapter 17, in which Arthur Pym acknowledged his responsibility for the sad and tragic events which were the result of his advice. It was, in fact, he who over-persuaded Captain William Guy, urging him to profit by so tempting an opportunity of solving the great problem relating to the Antarctic continent. And besides, while accepting that responsibility, did he not congratulate himself on having been the instrument of a great discovery, and having aided in some degree to reveal to science one of the most marvellous secrets which had ever claimed its attention? At 6 o'clock the sun disappeared behind a thick curtain of mist. After midnight the breeze freshened, and the Halbrane's progress marked a dozen additional miles. On the morrow the good ship was less than the third of a degree, that is to say, less than 20 miles from Tsalal Island. Unfortunately, just after midday the wind fell. Nevertheless, thanks to the current, the island of Tsalal was signalled at 45 minutes past 6 in the evening. The anchor was cast, a watch was set, with loaded firearms within hand reach, and boarding nets ready. The Halbrane ran no risk of being surprised. Two eyes were watching on board, especially those of Hunt, whose gaze never quitted the horizon of that southern zone for an instant. Chapter 16. Tsalal Island. The night passed without alarm. No boat had put off from the island, nor had a native shown himself upon the beach. The Halbrane, then, had not been observed on her arrival. This was all the better. We had cast anchor in 10 fathoms, at 3 miles from the coast. When the Jane appeared in these waters, the people of Tsalal beheld a ship for the first time, and they took it for an enormous animal, regarding its masts as limbs and its sails as garments. Now they ought to be better informed on this subject, and if they did not attempt to visit us, to what motive were we to assign such conduct? Captain Len Guy gave orders for the lowering of the ship's largest boat in a voice which betrayed his impatience. The order was executed, and the captain, addressing West, said: "Send 8 men down, with Martin Holt. Send Hunt to the helm. Remain yourself at the moorings, and keep a look-out landwards as well as to sea." "Aye, aye, sir. Don't be uneasy." "We are going ashore, and we shall try to gain the village of Cluck Cluck. If any difficulty should arise on sea, give us warning by firing 3 shots." "All right," replied West, "at a minute's interval." "If we should not return before evening, send the second boat with 10 armed men under the boatswain's orders, and let them station themselves within a cable's length of the shore, so as to escort us back. You understand?" "Perfectly, captain." "If we are not to be found, after you have done all in your power, you will take command of the schooner, and bring her back to the Falklands." "I will do so." The large boat was rapidly got ready. 8 men embarked in it, including Martin Holt and Hunt, all armed with rifles, pistols, and knives. The latter weapons were slung in their belts. They also carried cartridge pouches. I stepped forward and said: "Will you not allow me to accompany you, captain?" "If you wish to do so, Mr. Jeorling." I went to my cabin, took my gun, a repeating rifle with ball and powder, and rejoined Captain Len Guy, who had kept a place in the stern of the boat for me. Our object was to discover the passage through which Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters had crossed the reef on the 19th of January, 1828, in the Jane's boat. For 20 minutes we rowed along the reef, and then Hunt discovered the pass, which was through a narrow cut in the rocks. Leaving 2 men in the boat, we landed, and having gone through the winding gorge which gave access to the crest of the coast, our little force, headed by Hunt, pushed on towards the centre of the island. Captain Len Guy and myself exchanged observations, as we walked, on the subject of this country, which, as Arthur Pym declared, differed essentially from every other land hitherto visited by human beings. We soon found that Pym's description was trustworthy. The general colour of the plains was black, as though the clay were made of lava dust. Nowhere was anything white to be seen. At 100 paces distance, Hunt began to run towards an enormous mass of rock, climbed on it with great agility, and looked out over a wide extent of space like a man who ought to recognize the place he is in, but does not. "What is the matter with him?" asked Captain Len Guy, who was observing Hunt attentively. "I don't know what is the matter with him, captain, but, as you are aware, everything about this man is odd. His ways are inexplicable, and on certain sides of him he seems to belong to those strange beings whom Arthur Pym asserts that he found on this island. One would even say that—" "That?" repeated the captain. And then, without finishing my sentence, I said: "Captain, are you sure you made a good observation when you took the altitude yesterday?" "Certainly." "So that your point—" "Gave 83 degrees 20 minutes of latitude, and 43 degrees 5 minutes of longitude." "Exactly?" "Exactly." "There is, then, no doubt that we are on Tsalal Island?" "None, Mr. Jeorling, if Tsalal Island lies where Arthur Pym places it." This was quite true. There could be no doubt on the point, and yet of all that Arthur Pym described nothing existed, or rather nothing was any longer to be seen. Not a tree, not a shrub, not a plant was visible in the landscape. There was no sign of the wooded hills between which the village of Klock Klock ought to lie, or of the streams from which the crew of the Jane had not ventured to drink. There was no water anywhere, but everywhere absolute, awful drought. Nevertheless, Hunt walked on rapidly, without showing any hesitation. It seems as though he was led by a natural instinct, a bee's flight, as we say in America. I know not what presentiment induced us to follow him as the best of guides, a Chingachgook, a Renard Subtil. And why not? Was not he the fellow countryman of Fenimore Cooper's heroes? But I must repeat that we had not before our eyes that fabulous land which Arthur Pym described. The soil we were treading had been ravaged, wrecked, torn by convulsion. It was black, a cindery black, as though it had been vomited from the earth under the action of Plutonian forces. It suggested that some appalling and irresistible cataclysm had overturned the whole of its surface. Not one of the animals mentioned in the narrative was to be seen, and even the penguins which abound in the Antarctic regions had fled from this uninhabitable land. Its stern silence and solitude made it a hideous desert. No human being was to be seen either on the coast or in the interior. Did any chance of finding William Guy and the survivors of the Jane exist in the midst of this scene of desolation? I looked at Captain Len Guy. His pale face, dim eyes, and knit brow told too plainly that hope was beginning to die within his breast. And then the population of Tsalal Island, the almost naked men, armed with clubs and lances, the tall, well-made, upstanding women, endowed with grace and freedom of bearing not to be found in a civilized society. Those are the expressions of Arthur Pym, and the crowd of children accompanying them. What had become of all these? Where were the multitude of natives with black skins, black hair, black teeth, who regarded white colour with deadly terror? All of a sudden a light flashed upon me. "An earthquake!" I exclaimed. "Yes, 2 or 3 of those terrible shocks, so common in these regions, where the sea penetrates by infiltration, and a day comes when the quantity of accumulated vapour makes its way out and destroys everything on the surface." "Could an earthquake have changed Tsalal Island to such an extent?" asked Len Guy, musingly. "Yes, captain, an earthquake has done this thing. It has destroyed every trace of all that Arthur Pym saw here." Hunt, who had drawn nigh to us, and was listening, nodded his head in approval of my words. "Are these not countries of the southern seas volcanic?" I resumed. "If the Halbrane were to transport us to Victoria Island, we might find the Erebus and the Terror in the midst of an eruption." "And yet," observed Martin Holt, "if there had been an eruption here, we should find lava beds." "I did not say there has been an eruption," I replied, "but I do say the soil has been convulsed by an earthquake." On reflection it will be seen that the explanation given by me deserved to be admitted. And then it came to my remembrance that according to Arthur Pym's narrative, Tsalal belonged to a group of islands which extended towards the west. Unless the people of Tsalal had been destroyed, it was possible that they might have fled into one of the neighbouring islands. We should do well, then, to go and reconnoitre that archipelago, for Tsalal clearly had no resources whatever to offer after the cataclysm. I spoke of this to the captain. "Yes," he replied, and tears stood in his eyes. "Yes, it may be so. And yet, how could my brother and his unfortunate companions have found the means of escaping? Is it not far more probable that they all perished in the earthquake?" Here Hunt made us a signal to follow him, and we did so. After he had pushed across the valley for a considerable distance, he stopped. What a spectacle was before our eyes! There, lying in heaps, were human bones, all the fragments of that framework of humanity which we call the skeleton, hundreds of them, without a particle of flesh, clusters of skulls still bearing some tufts of hair, a vast bone heap, dried and whitened in this place. We were struck dumb and motionless by this spectacle. When Captain Len Guy could speak, he murmured, "My brother,
My poor brother! On a little reflection, however, my mind refused to admit certain things. How was this catastrophe to be reconciled with Patterson's memoranda? The entries in his notebook stated explicitly that the mate of the Jane had left his companions on Tsalal Island 7 months previously. They could not have perished in this earthquake, for the state of the bones proved that it had taken place several years earlier, and must have occurred after the departure of Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters, since no mention of it was made in the narrative of the former. These facts, then, were irreconcilable. If the earthquake was of recent date, the presence of those time-bleached skeletons could not be attributed to its action. In any case, the survivors of the Jane were not among them. But then, where were they? The valley of Klock Klock extended no further. We had to retrace our steps in order to regain the coast. We had hardly gone half a mile on the cliff's edge when Hunt again stopped, on perceiving some fragments of bone which were turning to dust, and did not seem to be those of a human being. Were these the remains of one of the strange animals described by Arthur Pym, of which we had not hitherto seen any specimens? Hunt suddenly uttered a cry, or rather a sort of savage growl, and held out his enormous hand, holding a metal collar. Yes, a brass collar, a collar eaten by rust, but bearing letters which might still be deciphered. These letters formed the 3 following words: Tiger, Arthur Pym. Tiger! The name of the dog which had saved Arthur Pym's life in the hold of the Grampus, and, during the revolt of the crew, had sprung at the throat of Jones the sailor, and who was immediately finished by Dirk Peters. So, then, that faithful animal had not perished in the shipwreck of the Grampus. He had been taken on board the Jane at the same time as Arthur Pym and the half-breed, and yet the narrative did not allude to this, and after the meeting with the schooner there was no longer any mention of the dog. All these contradictions occurred to me. I could not reconcile the facts. Nevertheless, there could be no doubt that Tiger had been saved from the shipwreck like Arthur Pym, had escaped the landslip of the Klock Klock Hill, and had come to his death at last in the catastrophe which had destroyed a portion of the population of Tsalal. But again, William Guy and his 5 sailors could not be among those skeletons which were strewn upon the earth, since they were living at the time of Patterson's departure 7 months ago, and the catastrophe already dated several years back. 3 hours later we had returned on board the Halbrane, without having made any other discovery. Captain Len Guy went direct to his cabin, shut himself up there, and did not reappear even at dinner hour. The following day, as I wished to return to the island in order to resume its exploration from one coast to the other, I requested West to have me rowed ashore. He consented, after he had been authorized by Captain Len Guy, who did not come out with us. Hunt, the boatswain, Martin Holt, 4 men, and myself took our places in the boat without arms, for there was no longer anything to fear. We disembarked at our yesterday's landing place, and Hunt again led the way towards the hill of Klock Klock. Nothing remained of the eminence that had been carried away in the artificial landslip from which the captain of the Jane, Patterson, his second officer, and 5 of his men had happily escaped. The village of Klock Klock had thus disappeared, and doubtless the mystery of the strange discoveries narrated in Arthur Poe's work was now and ever would remain beyond solution. We had only to regain our ship, returning by the east side of the coast. Hunt brought us through the space where the sheds had been erected for the preparation of the bêche de mer, and we saw the remains of them. On all sides silence and abandonment reigned. We made a brief pause at the place where Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters seized upon the boat which bore them towards higher latitudes, even to that horizon of dark vapour whose rents permitted them to discern the huge human figure, the white giant. Hunt stood with crossed arms, his eyes devouring the vast extent of the sea. "Well, Hunt?" said I tentatively. Hunt did not appear to hear me. He did not turn his head in my direction. "What are we doing here?"
I asked him, and touched him on the shoulder. He started, and cast a glance upon me which went to my heart.
"Come along, Hunt!" cried Hurliguerly. "Are you going to take root on this rock? Don't you see the Halbrane waiting for us at her moorings? Come along! We shall be off to-morrow. There is nothing more to do here."
It seemed to me that Hunt's trembling lips repeated the word nothing, while his whole bearing protested against what the boatswain said. The boat brought us back to the ship. Captain Len Guy had not left his cabin. West, having received no orders, was pacing the deck aft. I seated myself at the foot of the mainmast, observing the sea which lay open and free before us. At this moment the captain came on deck. He was very pale, and his features looked pinched and weary.
"Mr. Jeorling," said he, "I can affirm conscientiously that I have done all it was possible to do. Can I hope henceforth that my brother William and his companions... No, no, we must go away before winter." He drew himself up and cast a last glance towards Tsalal Island. "To-morrow, Jim," he said to West, "to-morrow we will make sail as early as possible." At this moment a rough voice uttered the words, "And Pym, poor Pym." I recognized this voice. It was the voice I had heard in my dream. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17, Part 1. And Pym. And Pym, poor Pym. I turned round quickly. Hunt had spoken. This strange person was standing motionless at a little distance, gazing fixedly at the horizon. It was so unusual to hear Hunt's voice on board the schooner that the men whom the unaccustomed sound reached drew near, moved by curiosity. Did not this unexpected intervention point to, I had a presentiment that it did, some wonderful revelation? A movement of West's hand sent the men forward, leaving only the mate, the boatswain, Martin Holt, the sailing master, and Hardy, with the captain and myself in the vicinity of Hunt. The captain approached and addressed him. "What did you say?" "I said, and Pym, poor Pym." "Well, then, what do you mean by repeating the name of the man whose pernicious advice led my brother to the island on which the Jane was lost, the greater part of her crew was massacred, and where we have not found even one left of those who were still here 7 months ago?" Hunt did not speak. "Answer, I say, answer!" cried the captain. Hunt hesitated, not because he did not know what to say, but from a certain difficulty in expressing his ideas. The latter were quite clear, but his speech was confused, his words were unconnected. He had a certain language of his own, which sometimes was picturesque, and pronunciation was strongly marked by the hoarse accent of the Indians of the far west. "You see," he said, "I do not know how to tell things. My tongue stops. Understand me. I spoke of Pym, poor Pym, did I not?" "Yes," answered West sternly. "And what have you to say about Arthur Pym?" "I have to say that he must not be abandoned." "Abandoned!" I exclaimed. "No, never. It would be cruel, too cruel. We must go to seek him." "To seek him?" repeated Captain Len Guy. "Understand me. It is for this that I have embarked on the Halbrane. Yes, to find poor Pym." "And where is he," I asked, "if not in a deep grave in the cemetery of his natal city?" "No, he is in a place where he remained, alone, all alone," continued Hunt, pointing towards the south. "And since then the sun has risen on that horizon 7 times." It was evident that Hunt intended to designate the Antarctic regions, but what did he mean by this? "Do you not know that Arthur Pym is dead?" said the captain. "Dead?" replied Hunt, emphasizing the word with an expressive gesture. "No. Listen to me. I know things. Understand me. He is not dead." "Come now, Hunt," said I, "remember what you do know. In the last chapter of the adventures of Arthur Pym, does not Edgar Poe relate his sudden and deplorable end?" "Explain yourself, Hunt," said the captain, in a tone of command. Reflect, take your time, and say plainly whatever you have to say." And while Hunt passed his hand over his brow, as though to collect his memory of far off things, I observed to Captain Len Guy, "There is something very singular in the intervention of this man, if indeed he be not mad." At my words the boatswain shook his head, for he did not believe Hunt to be in his right mind. The latter understood this shake of the boatswain's head, and cried out in a harsh tone, "No, not mad! And madmen are respected on the prairies, even if they are not believed. And I must be believed. No, 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 Pym is not dead." "Edgar Poe asserts that he is," I replied. "Yes, I know, Edgar Poe of Baltimore, but he never saw poor Pym, never, never." "What!" exclaimed Captain Len Guy. "The two men were not acquainted?" "No." "And it was not Arthur Pym himself who related his adventures to Poe?" "No, captain, no. He below there, at Baltimore, had only the notes written by Pym from the day when he hid himself on board the Grampus, to the very last hour, the last, understand me, the last." "Who, then, brought back the journal?" asked Captain Len Guy, as he seized Hunt's hand. "It was Pym's companion, he who loved him, his poor Pym, like a son. It was Dirk Peters, the half-breed, who came back alone from there, beyond." "The half-breed Dirk Peters!" I exclaimed. "Yes." "Alone?" "Alone." "And Arthur Pym may be—" "There," answered Hunt, in a loud voice, bending towards the southern line, from which he had not diverted his gaze for a moment. Could such an assertion prevail against the general incredulity? No, assuredly not. Martin Holt nudged Hurliguerly with his elbow, and both regarded Hunt with pity, while West observed him without speaking. Captain Len Guy made me a sign, meaning that nothing serious was to be got of this poor fellow, whose mental faculties must have been out of gear for a long time. And nevertheless, when I looked keenly at Hunt, it seemed to me that a sort of radiance of truth shone out of his eyes. Then I set to work to interrogate the man, putting him to precise and pressing questions, which he tried to answer categorically, as we shall see, and not once did he contradict himself. "Tell me," I asked, "did Arthur Pym really come to Tsalal Island on board the Grampus?" "Yes." "Did Arthur Pym separate himself with the half-breed and one of the sailors from his companions while Captain William Guy had gone to the village of Klock Klock?" "Yes. The sailor was one Allen, and he was almost immediately stifled under the stones." "Then the two others saw the attack and the destruction of the schooner from the top of the hill?" "Yes." "Then, some time later, the two left the island, after they had got possession of one of the boats which the natives could not take from them?" "Yes." "And after 20 days, having reached the front of the curtain of vapour, they were both carried down into the Gulf of the Cataract?" This time Hunt did not reply in the affirmative. He hesitated. He stammered out some vague words. He seemed to be trying to rekindle the half-extinguished flame of his memory. At length, looking at me and shaking his head, he answered, "No, not both. Understand me, Dirk never told me—" "Dirk Peters!" interposed Captain Len Guy quickly. "You knew Dirk Peters?" "Yes." "Where?" "At Vandalia, State of Illinois." "And it is from him that you have all this information concerning the voyage?" "From him." "And he came back alone from that voyage, having left Arthur Pym?" "Alone." "Speak, man, do speak!" I cried impatiently. Then, in broken but intelligible sentences, Hunt spoke. "Yes, there... a curtain of vapour, so the half-breed often said. Understand me. The two, Arthur Pym and he, were in Tsalal boat. Then an enormous block of ice came full upon them, and at the shock Dirk Peters was thrown into the sea, but he clung to the ice block, and understand me, he saw the boat drift with the current, far, very far, too far. In vain did Pym try to rejoin his companion, he could not. The boat drifted on, and Pym, that poor dear Pym, was carried away. It is he who has never come back, and he is there, still there." If Hunt had been the half-breed in person, he could not have spoken with more heartfelt emotion of poor Pym. It was then, in front of the curtain of vapour,
that Arthur Pym and the half-breed had been separated from each other. Dirk Peters had succeeded in returning from the ice world to America, whither he conveyed the notes that were communicated to Edgar Poe. Hunt was minutely questioned upon all these points, and he replied, conformably, he declared, to what the half-breed had told him many times. According to this statement, Dirk Peters had Arthur Pym's notebook in his pocket at the moment when the ice block struck them, and thus the journal which the half-breed placed at the disposal of the American romance writer was saved. "Understand me," Hunt repeated, "for I tell you things as I have them from Dirk Peters. While the drift was carrying him away he cried out with all his strength. Pym, poor Pym, had already disappeared in the midst of the vapour. The half-breed, feeding upon raw fish which he contrived to catch, was carried back by a cross-current to Tsalal Island, where he landed, half dead from hunger." "To Tsalal Island!" exclaimed Captain Len Guy. "And how long was it since they had left it?" 3 weeks, yes, 3 weeks at the furthest, so Dirk Peters told me." "Then he must have found all that remained of the crew of the Jane, my brother William, and those who had survived with him?" "No," replied Hunt, "and Dirk Peters always believed that they had perished. Yes, to the very last man. There was no one upon the island." "No one?" "Not a living soul." "But the population?" "No one. No one, I tell you. The island was a desert. Yes, a desert." This statement contradicted certain facts of which we were absolutely certain. After all, though, when Dirk Peters returned to Tsalal Island, the population, seized by who can tell what terror, had already taken refuge upon the south-western group, and that William Guy and his companions were still hidden in the gorges of Klock Klock. That would explain why Half-Breed had not come across them, and also why survivors of the Jane had nothing to fear during 11 years of their sojourn on the island. On the other hand, since Patterson had left them there 7 previously, if we did not find them, that must have been because they had been obliged to leave Tsalal Island, it being rendered uninhabitable by the earthquake. "So that," resumed Captain Len Guy, "on the return of Dirk Peters there is no longer an inhabitant on the island?" "Not one," repeated Hunt. "Not one. The half-breed did not meet a single native." "And what did Dirk Peters do?" "Understand me. A forsaken boat lay there at the back of the bay, contained some dried meat and several casks of water. The half-breed got into it, and a south wind, yes, south, very strong, the same that had driven the ice block with the cross-current towards Tsalal Island, carried him on for weeks and weeks to the ice barrier, through a passage in it. You may believe me, I'm telling you only what Dirk Peters told me, and he cleared the polar circle." "And beyond it?" I inquired. "Beyond it he was picked up by an American whaler, the Sandy Hook, and taken back to America." Now one thing at all events was clear. Edgar Poe had never known Arthur Pym. This was the reason why, to leave his readers in exciting uncertainty, he had brought Pym to an end as sudden as it was deplorable, without indicating the manner or the cause of his death. And yet, although Arthur Pym did not return, could it be reasonably admitted that he had survived his companion for any length of time, that he was still living, 11 years having elapsed since his disappearance? "Yes, yes," replied Hunt. And this he affirmed with the strong conviction that Dirk Peters had infused into his mind while the two were living together in Vandalia, in Illinois. Now the question arose, was Hunt sane? Was it not he who had stolen into my cabin in a fit of insanity? Of this I had no doubt, and murmured in my ear the words, "And Pym, poor Pym." Yes, and I had not been dreaming. In short, if all that Hunt had said was true, if he was but the faithful reporter of secrets which had been entrusted to him by Dirk Peters, ought he to be believed when he repeated in a tone of mingled command and entreaty, "Pym is not dead. Pym is there. Poor Pym must not be forsaken." When I had made an end of questioning Hunt, Captain Len Guy came out of his meditative mood, profoundly troubled, and gave the word, "All hands forward!" When the men were assembled around him, he said,
Listen to me, Hunt, and seriously consider the gravity of the questions I am about to put to you."
Hunt held his head up and ran his eyes over the crew of the Halbrane.
"You assert, Hunt, that all you have told us concerning Arthur Pym is true?"
"Yes."
"You knew Dirk Peters?"
"Yes."
"You lived some years with him in Illinois?"
"9 years."
"And he often related these things to you?"
"Yes."
"And for your own part you have no doubt that he told you the exact truth?"
"None."
"Well, then, did it ever occur to him that some of the crew of the Jane might have remained on Tsalal Island?"
"No."
"He believed that Captain William Guy and his companions must all have perished in the landslip of the hill of Klock Klock?"
"Yes, and from what he often repeated to me, Pym believed it also."
"Where did you see Dirk Peters for the last time?"
"At Vandalia."
"How long ago?"
"Over 2 years."
"And which of you two was the first to leave Vandalia?"
I thought I detected a slight hesitation in Hunt before he answered. "We left the place together."
"You to go to?"
"The Falklands."
"And he?"
"He?" replied Hunt. And then his wandering gaze fixed itself on Martin Holt, our sailing master, whose life he had saved at the risk of his own during the tempest.
"Well," resumed the captain, "do you not understand what I am asking you?"
"Yes."
"Then answer me. When Dirk Peters left Illinois, did he finally give up America?"
"Yes."
"To go whither? Speak."
"To the Falklands."
"And where is he now?"
"He stands before you." Dirk Peters. Hunt was the half-breed Dirk Peters, the devoted companion of Arthur Pym, he whom Captain Guy had so long sought for in the United States, and whose presence was probably to furnish us with a fresh reason for pursuing our daring campaign. I shall not at all be surprised if my readers have already recognized Dirk Peters in Hunt. Indeed, I shall be astonished if they have failed to do so. The extraordinary thing is that Captain Len Guy and myself, who had read Edgar Poe's book over and over again, did not see at once, when Hunt came on the ship at the Falklands, that he and the half-breed were identical. I can only admit that we were both blindfolded by some hidden action of fate, just when certain pages of that book ought to have effectually cleared our vision. There was no doubt whatever that Hunt really was Dirk Peters. Although he was 11 years older, he answered in every particular to the description of him given by Arthur Pym, except that he was no longer of fierce aspect. In fact, the half-breed had changed with age and the experience of terrible scenes through which he had passed. Nevertheless, he was still the faithful companion to whom Arthur Pym had often owed his safety. That same Dirk Peters who loved him as his own son, and who had never, no never, lost the hope of finding him again one day amid the awful Antarctic wastes. Now why had Dirk Peters hidden himself in the Falklands under the name of Hunt? Why, since his embarkation on the Halbrane, had he kept up that incognito? Why had he not told who he was, since he was aware of the intentions of the captain, who was about to make every effort to save his countrymen by following the course of the Jane? Why? No doubt because he feared that his name would inspire horror. Was it not the name of one who had shared in the horrible scenes of the Grampus, who had killed Parker, the sailor who had fed upon the man's flesh, and quenched his thirst in the man's blood? To induce him to reveal his name, he must be assured that the Halbrane would attempt to discover and rescue Arthur Pym. And as to the existence of Arthur Pym, I confess that my reason did not rebel against the admission of it as a possibility. The imploring cry of the half-breed, "Pym, poor Pym, he must not be forsaken," troubled me profoundly. Assuredly, since I had resolved to take part in the expedition of the Halbrane, I was no longer the same man. A long silence had followed the astounding declaration of the half-breed. None dreamed of doubting his veracity. He had said, "I am Dirk Peters." He was Dirk Peters. End of chapter 17, part 1. Chapter 17, Part 2, and Pym. At length, moved by irresistible impulse, I said, "My friends, before any decision is made, let us carefully consider the situation. Should we not lay up everlasting regret for ourselves if we were to abandon our expedition at the very moment when it promises to succeed? Reflect upon this, captain, and you, my companions. It is less than 7 months since Patterson left your countrymen alive on Tsalal Island. If they were there then, the fact proves that for 11 years they have been enabled to exist on the resources provided by the island, having nothing to fear from the islanders, some of whom had fallen victim to circumstances unknown to us, and others had probably transferred themselves to some neighbouring island. This is quite plain, and I do not see how any objection can be raised to my reasoning." No one made answer. There was none to be made. "If we have not come across the captain of the Jane and his people," I resumed, "it is because they have been obliged to abandon Tsalal Island since Patterson's departure. Why, in my belief it was because the earthquake had rendered the island uninhabitable. Now they would only have required a native boat to gain either another island or some point of the Antarctic continent by the aid of the southern current. I hardly hesitate to assert that all this has occurred. But in any case, I know, and I repeat, that we shall have done nothing if we do not persevere in the search on which the safety of your countrymen depends." I questioned my audience by a searching look. No answer. Captain Len Guy, whose emotion was unrestrained, bowed his head, for he felt that I was right, that by invoking the duties of humanity I was prescribing the only course open to men with feeling hearts. "And what is in question?" I continued, after the silent pause. "To accomplish a few degrees of latitude, and that while the sea is open, while we have 2 months of good weather to look for, and nothing to fear from the southern winter. I certainly should not ask you to brave its severity. And shall we hesitate when the Halbrane is abundantly furnished, her crew complete and in good health? Shall we take fright at imaginary dangers? Shall we not have courage to go on thither?" And I pointed to the southern horizon. Dirk Peters pointed to it also, with an imperative gesture which spoke for him. Still the eyes of all were fixed upon us, but there was no response. I continued to urge every argument, and to quote every example in favour of the safety of pursuing our voyage, but the silence was unbroken, and now the men stood with eyes cast down. And yet I had not once pronounced the name of Dirk Peters, nor alluded to Dirk Peters' proposal. I was asking myself whether I had or had not succeeded in inspiring my companions with my own belief, when Captain Len Guy spoke. "Dirk Peters," he said, "do you assert that Arthur Pym and you, after your departure from Tsalal Island, saw land in the direction of the south?" "Yes, land," answered the half-breed. "Islands or continents, understand me, and I believe that Pym, poor Pym, is waiting there until aid comes to him." "There, where perhaps William Guy and his companions are also waiting," said I, to bring back the discussion to more practical points. Captain Len Guy reflected for a little while, and then spoke. "Is it true, Dirk Peters," he asked, "that beyond the 84th parallel the horizon is shut in by that curtain of vapour which is described in the narrative? Have you seen with your own eyes, those cataracts in the air, that gulf in which Arthur Pym's boat was lost?" The half-breed looked from one to the other of us, and shook his big head. "I don't know," he said. "What are you asking me about, captain? A curtain of vapour? Yes, perhaps, and also appearances of land towards the south." Evidently Dirk Peters had never read Edgar Poe's book, and very likely did not know how to read. After having handed over Pym's journal, he had not troubled himself about its publication. Having retired to Illinois at first, and to the Falklands afterwards, he had no notion of the stir that the work had made, or of the fantastic and base-line climax to which our great poet had brought those strange adventurers. And besides, might not Arthur Pym himself, with his tendency to the supernatural, have fancied that he saw these wondrous things, due solely to his imaginative brain? Then, for the first time in the course of this discussion, West's voice made itself heard. I had no idea which side he would take. The first words he uttered were, "Captain, your orders?" Captain Len Guy turned towards his crew, who surrounded him, both the old and the new. Hearne remained in the background, ready to intervene if he should think it necessary. The captain questioned the boatswain and his comrades, whose devotion was unreservedly his, by a long and anxious look, and I heard him mutter between his teeth, "Ah, if it depended only on me, if I were sure of the assent and the help of them all!" Then Hearne spoke roughly. "Captain," said he, "it is 2 months since we left the Falklands. Now my companions were engaged for a voyage which was not to take them further beyond the icebergs than Tsalal Island." "That is not so!" exclaimed Captain Len Guy. "No, that is not so. I recruited you all for an enterprise which I have a right to pursue so far as I please." "Beg pardon," said Hearne coolly, "but we have come to a point which no navigator has ever yet reached, in a sea no ship except the Jane has ever ventured into before us, and therefore my comrades and I mean to return to the Falklands before the bad season. From there you can return to Tsalal Island, and even go on to the Pole if you so please." A murmur of approbation greeted his words. No doubt the sealing master justly interpreted the sentiments of the majority, composed of the new recruits. To go against their opinion, to exact the obedience of these ill-disposed men, and under such conditions to risk the unknown Antarctic waters, would have been an act of temerity, or rather an act of madness, that would have brought about some catastrophe. Nevertheless, West, advancing upon Hearne, said to him in a threatening tone, "Who gave you leave to speak?" "The captain questioned us," replied Hearne. "I had a right to reply." The man uttered these words with such insolence that West, who was generally so self-restrained, was about to give free vent to his wrath, when Captain Len Guy, stopping him by a motion of his hand, said quietly, "Be calm, Jem. Nothing can be done unless we are all agreed. What is your opinion, Hurliguerly?" "It is very clear, captain," replied the boatswain. "I will obey your orders, whatever they may be. It is our duty not to forsake William Guy and the others, so long as any chance of saving them remains." The boatswain paused for a moment, while several of the sailors gave unequivocal signs of approbation. "As for what concerns Arthur Pym—" "There is no question of Arthur Pym," struck in the captain, "but only of my brother William and his companions." I saw at this moment that Dirk Peters was about to protest, and caught hold of his arm. He shook with anger, but kept silence. The captain continued his questioning of the men, desiring to know by name all those upon whom he might reckon. The old crew to a man acquiesced in his proposals, and pledged themselves to obey his orders implicitly, and follow him whithersoever he chose to go. 3 only of the recruits joined those faithful seamen. These were English sailors. The others were of Hearne's opinion, holding that for them the campaign was ended at Tsalal Island. They therefore refused to go beyond that point, and formally demanded that the ship should be steered northward, so as to clear the icebergs at the most favourable period of the season. 20 men were on their side, and to constrain them to lend a hand to the working of the ship if she were to be diverted to the south would have been to provoke them to rebel. There was but one resource to arouse their covetousness, to strike the chord of self-interest. I intervened, therefore, and addressed them in a way which placed the seriousness of my proposal beyond a doubt. "Men of the Halbrane, listen to me. Just as various states have done for voyages of discovery in the polar regions, I offer a reward to the crew of this schooner. $2,000 shall be shared among you for every degree we make beyond the 84th parallel." Nearly $70 to each man. This was a strong temptation. I felt that I had hit the mark.
"I will sign an agreement to that effect," I continued, "with Captain Len Guy as your representative, and the sums gained shall be handed to you on your return, no matter under what conditions that return be accomplished." I waited for the effect of this promise, and, to tell the truth, I had not long to wait. "Hurrah!" cried the boatswain, acting as fugleman to his comrades, who almost unanimously added their cheers to his. Hearne offered no further opposition. It would always be in his power to put in his word when the stances should be more propitious. Thus the bargain was made, and, to gain my ends, I have made a heavier sacrifice. It is true we were within 7° of the south, and if the Halbrane should indeed reach that spot, it would never cost me more than $14,000. Early in the morning of the 27th of December, the Halbrane put out to sea, heading south-west. After the scene of the preceding evening, Captain Len Guy had taken a few hours' rest. I met him the next day on deck, while West was going about fore and aft, and he called us both to him. "Mr. Jeorling," he said, "it was with a terrible pang that I came to the resolution to bring our schooner back to the north. I felt I had not done all I ought to do for our unhappy fellow countrymen, but I knew that the majority of the crew would be against me if I insisted on going beyond Tsalal Island." "That is true, captain. There was a beginning of indiscipline on board, and perhaps it might have ended in a revolt." "A revolt we should have speedily put down," said West, coolly, "were it only by knocking Hearne, who is always exciting the mutinous men, on the head." "And you would have done well, Jem," said the captain. "Only justice being satisfied, what would have become of the agreement together, which we must have in order to do anything? Of course, captain, it is better that things passed off without violence, but for the future Hearne will have to look out for himself." "His companions," observed the captain, "are now greedy for the prizes that have been promised them. The greed of gain will make them more willing and persevering. The generosity of Mr. Jeorling has succeeded where our entreaties would undoubtedly have failed. I thank him for it." Captain Len Guy held out a hand to me, which I grasped cordially. After some general conversation relating to our purpose, the ship's course, and the proposed verification of the bearings of the group of islands on the west of Tsalal, which is described by Arthur Pym, the captain said: "As it is possible that the ravages of the earthquake did not extend to this group, and that it may still be inhabited, we must be on our guard in approaching the bearings." "Which cannot be far off," I added. "And then, captain, who knows but that your brother and his sailors might have taken refuge on one of these islands?" This was admissible, but not a consoling eventuality, for in that case the poor fellows would have fallen into the hands of those savages of whom they were rid while they remained at Tsalal. "Jem," resumed Captain Len Guy, "we are making good way, and no doubt land will be signalled in a few hours. Give orders for the watch to be careful." "It's done, captain." "There's a man in the crow's nest?" "Dirk Peters himself, at his own request." "All right, Jem. We may trust his vigilance." "And also his eyes," I added, "for he is gifted with amazing sight." For 2 hours of quick sailing, not the smallest indication of the group of 8 islands was visible. "It is incomprehensible that we could not come in sight of them," said the captain. "I reckon that the Halbrane has made 60 miles since this morning, and the islands in question are tolerably close together." "Then, captain, we must conclude, and it is not unlikely, that the group to which Tsalal belonged has entirely disappeared in the earthquake." "Land ahead!" cried Dirk Peters. We looked, but could discern nothing on the sea. Nor was it until a quarter of an hour had elapsed that our glasses enabled us to recognize the tops of a few scattered islets shining in the oblique rays of the sun 2 or 3 miles to the westward. What a change! How had it come about? Arthur Pym described spacious islands, but only a small number of tiny islets, half a dozen at most, protruded from the waters. At this moment the half-breed came sliding down from his lofty perch, and jumped to the deck. "Well, Dirk Peters, "Have you recognized the group?" asked the captain. "The group?" replied the half-breed, shaking his head. "No, I have only seen the tops of 5 or 6 islets. There is nothing but stone heaps there, not a single island." As the schooner approached we easily recognized these fragments of the group, which had been almost entirely destroyed on its western side. The scattered remains formed dangerous reefs, which might seriously injure the keel or the sides of the Halbrane, and there was no intention of risking the ship's safety among them. We accordingly cast anchor at a safe distance, and a boat was lowered for the reception of Captain Len Guy, the boatswain, Dirk Peters, Holt, 2 men, and myself. The still, transparent water, as Peters steered us skilfully between the projecting edges of the little reefs, allowed us to see, not a bed of sand strewn with shells, but heaps which were overgrown by land vegetation, tufts, plants not belonging to the marine flora that floated on the surface of the sea. Presently we landed on one of the larger islets, which rose to about 30 feet above the sea. "Do the tides rise sometimes to that height?" I inquired of the captain. "Never," he replied, "and perhaps we shall discover some remains of the vegetable kingdom, of habitations, or of an encampment." "The best thing that we can do," said the boatswain, "is to follow Dirk Peters, who has already distanced us. The half-breed's lynx's eyes will see what we can't." Peters had indeed scaled the eminence in a moment, and we presently joined him on the top. The islet was strewn with the remains, probably of those domestic animals mentioned in Arthur Pym's journal, but these bones differed from the bones on Tsalal Island by the fact that the heaps dated from a few months only. This, then, agreed with the recent period at which we placed the earthquake. Besides, plants and tufts of flowers were growing here and there. "And these are this year's," I cried. "No southern winter has passed over them." These facts having been ascertained, no doubt could remain respecting the date of the cataclysm after the departure of Patterson. The destruction of the population of Tsalal, whose bones lay about the village, was not attributable to that catastrophe. William Guy and the 5 sailors of the Jane had been able to fly in time, since no bones that could be theirs had been found on the island. Where had they taken refuge? This was the ever-pressing question. What answer were we to obtain? Must we conclude that having reached one of these islets, they had perished in the swallowing up of the archipelago? We debated this point, as may be supposed, at a length and with detail which I can only indicate here. Suffice it to say that a decision was arrived at to the following effect. Our sole chance of discovering the unfortunate castaways was to continue our voyage for 2 or 3 parallels further. The goal was there, and which of us would not sacrifice even his life to attain it? "God is guiding us, Mr. Jeorling," said Captain Len Guy. End of chapter 17, part 2. Chapter 18, part 1. A Revelation. The following day, the 29th of December, at 6 in the morning, the schooner set sail with a north-east wind, and this time her course was due south. The 2 succeeding days passed wholly without incident. Neither land nor any sign of land was observed. The men on the Halbrane took great hauls of fish, to their own satisfaction and ours. It was New Year's Day, 1840, 4 months and 17 days since I had left the Kerguelens, and 2 months and 5 days since the Halbrane had sailed from the Falklands. The half-breed, between whom and myself an odd kind of tacit understanding subsisted, approached the bench on which I was sitting. The captain was in his cabin, and West was not in sight, with a plain intention of conversing with me. The subject may easily be guessed. "Dirk Peters," said I, taking up the subject at once, "do you wish that we should talk of him?" "Him," he murmured. "You have remained faithful to his memory, Dirk Peters." "Forget him, sir? Never!" "He is always there before you?" "Always. So many dangers shared, that makes brothers. No, it makes a father and his son. Yes, and I have seen America again. But Pym, poor Pym! He is still beyond there."
"Dirk Peters," I asked, "have you any idea of the route which you and Arthur Pym followed in the boat after your departure from Tsalal Island?"
"None, sir. Poor Pym had no longer any instrument, you know, sea machines, for looking at the sun. We could not know, except that for 8 days the current pushed us towards the south, and the wind also. A fine breeze, and a fair sea, and our shirts for a sail."
"Yes, white linen shirts, which frightened your prisoner Nu Nu."
"Perhaps so. I did not notice. But if Pym had said so, Pym must be believed."
"And during those 8 days you were able to supply yourselves with food?"
"Yes, sir, and the days after we and the savage, you know, the 3 turtles that were in the boat. These animals contain a store of fresh water, and their flesh is sweet, even raw. Oh, raw flesh, sir."
He lowered his voice and threw a furtive glance around him. It would be impossible to describe the frightful expression of the half breed's face as he thus recalled the terrible scenes of the Grampus. And it was not the expression of a cannibal of Australia or the New Hebrides, but that of a man who is pervaded by an insurmountable horror of himself. "Was it not on the 1st of March, Dirk Peters," I asked, "that you perceived for the first time the veil of grey vapour shot with luminous and moving rays?"
"I do not remember, sir, but if Pym says it was so, Pym must be believed."
"Did he never speak to you of fiery rays which fell from the sky?" I did not use the term polar aurora, lest the half-breed should not understand it.
"Never, sir,"
said Dirk Peters after some reflection. "Did you not remark that the colour of the sea changed, grew white like milk, and that its surface became ruffled around your boat?"
"It may have been so, sir. I did not observe. The boat went on, and my head went with it."
"And then the fine powder, as fine as ashes, that fell?"
"I don't remember it."
"Was it snow?"
"Snow? Yes. No. The weather was warm. What did Pym say? Pym must be believed."
He lowered his voice and continued,
"But Pym will tell you all that, sir. He knows. I do not know. He saw, and you will believe him."
"Yes, Dirk Peters, I shall believe him."
"We are to go in search of him, are we not?"
"I hope so."
"After we have found William Guy and the sailors of the Jane?"
"Yes, after."
"And even if we do not find them?"
"Yes, even in that case. I think I shall induce our captain. I think he will not refuse."
"No, he will not refuse to bring help to a man like him."
"And yet," I said, "if William Guy and his people are living, we can admit that Arthur Pym—"
"Living? Yes, living!"
cried the half-breed.
"By the Great Spirit of my fathers he is waiting for me, my poor Pym. How joyful he will be when he clasps his old Dirk in his arms, and I, when I feel him there.
And the huge chest of the man heaved like a stormy sea. Then he went away, leaving me inexpressibly affected by the revelation of the tenderness for his unfortunate companion that lay deep in the heart of this semi-savage. In the meantime I said but little to Captain Len Guy, whose whole heart and soul were set on the rescue of brother, of the possibility of our finding Arthur Gordon Pym. Time enough, if in the course of this strange enterprise of ours we succeeded in that object, to urge upon him one still more visionary. At length, on the 7th of January, according to Dirk Peters, who had fixed it only by the time that had expired, we arrived at the place where Nu Nu the savage breathed his last, lying in the bottom of the boat. On that day an observation gave 86° 33' for the latitude, the longitude remaining the same between the 42nd and the 43rd meridian. Here it was, according to the half-breed, that the two fugitives were parted after the collision between the boat and the floating mass of ice. But a question now arose, since the mass of ice carrying away Dirk Peters had drifted towards the north. Was this because it was subjected to the action of a counter-current? Yes, that must have been so, for our schooner had not felt the influence of the current which had guided her on leaving the Falklands for fully 4 days. And yet there is nothing surprising in that, for everything is variable in the austral seas. Happily the fresh breeze from the northeast continued to blow, and the Halbrane made progress towards higher water, 13 degrees in advance upon Weddell's ship and 2 degrees upon the Jane. As for the land, islands or continent, which Captain Len Guy was seeking on the surface of that vast ocean, it did not appear. I was well aware that he was gradually losing confidence in our enterprise. As for me, I was possessed by the desire to rescue Arthur Pym as well as the survivors of the Jane. And yet, how could he have survived? But then, the half-breed's fixed idea! Supposing our captain were to give the order to go back, what would Dirk Peters do? Throw himself into the sea rather than return northwards? This it was which made me dread some act of violence on his part, when he heard the greater number of the sailors protesting against this insensate voyage, and talking of putting the ship about, especially towards Hearne, who was stealthily inciting his comrades of the Falklands to insubordination. It was absolutely necessary not to allow discipline to decline, or discouragement to grow among the crew, so that, on the 7th of January, Captain Len Guy, at my request, assembled the men and addressed them in the following words: "Sailors of the Halbrane, since our departure from Tsalal Island, the schooner has gained 2 degrees southwards, and I now inform you that, conformably with the engagement signed by Mr. Jeorling, $4,000, that is $2,000 for each degree, are due to you and will be paid at the end of the voyage." These words were greeted with some murmurs of satisfaction, but not with cheers, except those of Hurliguerly the boatswain and Endicott the cook, which found no echo. On the 13th of January a conversation took place between the boatswain and myself of a nature to justify my anxiety concerning the temper of our crew. The men were at breakfast, with the exception of Drap and Stern. The schooner was cutting the water under a stiff breeze. I was walking between the fore and main masts, watching the great flights of birds wheeling about the ship with deafening clangour, and the petrels occasionally perching on our yards. No effort was made to catch or shoot them. It would have been useless cruelty, since their oily and stringy flesh is not eatable. At this moment Hurliguerly approached me, looked attentively at the birds, and said, "I remark one thing, Mr. Jeorling." "What is it, boatswain?" "That these birds do not fly so directly south as they did up to the present. Some of them are setting north." "I have noticed the same fact." "And I add, Mr. Jeorling, that those who are below there will come back without delay." "And you conclude from this?" "I conclude that they feel the approach of winter." "Of winter?" "Undoubtedly." "No, no, boatswain, the temperature is so high that the birds can't want to get to less cold regions so prematurely." "Oh, prematurely, Mr. Jeorling?" "Yes, boatswain. Do we not know that navigators have always been able to frequent the Antarctic waters until the month of March?" "Not at such a latitude. Besides, there are precocious winters as well as precocious summers. The fine season this year was full 2 months in advance, and it is to be feared the bad season may come sooner than usual." "That is very likely," I replied. "After all, it does not apply to us, since our campaign will be certainly over in 3 weeks." "If some obstacle does not arrive beforehand, Mr. Jeorling." "And what obstacle?" "For instance, a continent stretching to the south and barring our way." "A continent, Hurliguerly?" "I should not at all be surprised." "And in fact there would be nothing surprising in it." "As for the lands seen by Dirk Peters," said the boatswain, "were the men of the Jane might have landed on one or another of them. I don't believe in them." "Why?" "Because William Guy, who can only have had a small craft at his disposal, could not have got so far into these seas." "I do not feel quite so sure of that." "Nevertheless, Mr. Jeorling." "What would be so surprising in William Guy's being carried to land somewhere by the action of currents? He did not remain on board his boat for 8 months, I suppose. His companions and he may have been able to land on an island, or even on a continent, and that is a sufficient motive for us to pursue our search." "No doubt, but all are not of your opinion," replied Hurliguerly, shaking his head. "I know," said I,
and that is what makes me most anxious. Is the ill-feeling increasing? I fear so, Mr. Jeorling. The satisfaction of having gained several hundreds of dollars is already lessened, and the prospect of gaining a few more hundreds does not put a stop to disputes. And yet the prize is tempting. From Tsalal Island to the Pole, admitting that we might get there, is 6 degrees. Now 6 degrees at $2,000 each makes $12,000 for 30 men. That is $400 a head. A nice little sum to slip into one's pocket on the return of the Halbrane. But notwithstanding, that fellow Hearne works so wickedly upon his comrades that I believe they are ready to bout ship in spite of anybody."
"I can believe that of the recruits, boatswain, but the old crew?"
There are 3 or 4 of those who are beginning to reflect, and they are not easy in their minds about the prolongation of the voyage."
"I fancy Captain Len Guy and his lieutenant will know how to get themselves obeyed."
"We shall see, Mr. Jeorling. But may it not that our captain himself will get disheartened, that the sense of his responsibility will prevail, and that he will renounce his enterprise?"
"Yes, this is what I feared, and there was no remedy on that side."
"As for my friend Endicott, Mr. Jeorling, I answer for him as for myself. We would go to the end of the world, if the world has an end. Did the captain want to go there? True. We two, Dirk Peters and yourself, are but a few to be a law to the others."
"And what do you think of the half-breed?" I asked.
"Well, our men appear to accuse him chiefly of the prolongation of the voyage. You see, Mr. Jeorling, though you have a good deal to do with it, you pay, and pay well, while this crazy fellow Dirk Peters persists in asserting that his poor Pym is still living. His poor Pym, who was drowned, or frozen, or crushed, killed anyhow, one way or another, 11 years ago."
So completely was this my own belief that I never discussed the subject with the half-breed.
"You see, Mr. Jeorling," resumed the boatswain, "at the first some curiosity was felt about Dirk Peters. Then, after he saved Martin Holt, it was interest. Certainly he was no more talkative than before, and the bear came no oftener out of his den. But now we know what he is, and no one likes him the better for that. At all events, it was he who induced our captain, by talking of land to the south of Tsalal Island, to make this voyage, and it is owing to him that he has reached the 86th degree of latitude."
"That is quite true, boatswain."
"And so, Mr. Jeorling, I am always afraid that one of these days somebody will do Peters an ill turn."
"Dirk Peters would defend himself, and I should pity the man who laid a finger on him."
"Quite so. It would not be good for anybody to be in his hands, for they could bend iron. But then, all being against him, he would be forced into the hold."
Well, well, we have not yet come to that, I hope, and I count on you, Hurliguerly, to prevent any against Dirk Peters. Reason with your men, make them understand that we have time to return to the Falklands before the end of the fine season. Their reproaches must not be allowed to provide the captain with an excuse for turning back before the object is attained.
"Count on me, Mr. Jeorling. I will serve you to the best of my ability."
"You will not repent of doing so, Hurliguerly. Nothing is easier than to add a round zero to the $400 which each man is to have, if that man be something more than a sailor, even were his functions simply those of boatswain on board the Halbrane. Chapter 18 Part 2. A Revelation. Nothing important occurred on the 13th and 14th, but a fresh fall in the temperature took place. Captain Len Guy called my attention to this, pointing out the flocks of birds continuously flying north. While he was speaking to me, I felt that his last hopes were fading, and who could wonder? Of the land indicated by the half-breed nothing was seen, and we were already more than 180 miles past Tsalal Island. At every point of the compass was the sea, nothing but the vast sea with its desert horizon, which the sun's disk had been nearing since the 21st, and would touch on the 21st March, prior to during the 6 months of the austral night. Honestly, was it possible to admit that William Guy and his 5 companions could have accomplished such a distance on a craft, and was there one chance in 100 that they could ever be recovered? On the 15th of January an observation most carefully taken gave 43° 13' longitude and 88° 17' latitude. The Halbrane was less than 2 degrees from the pole. Captain Len Guy did not seek to conceal the result of this observation, and the sailors knew enough of nautical calculation to understand it. Besides, if the consequences had to be explained to them, were not Holt and Hardy there to do this, and Hearne to exaggerate them to the utmost? During the afternoon I had indubitable proof that the sealing master had been working on the minds of the crew. The men, emerging at the foot of the mainmast, talked in whispers and cast evil glances at us. 2 or 3 sailors made threatening gestures undisguisedly. Then arose such angry mutterings that West could not be deaf to them. He strode forward and called out, "Silence there! The first man who speaks will have to reckon with me." Captain Len Guy was shut up in his cabin, but every moment I expected to see him come out, give one last long look around the wastes of waters, and then order the ship's course to be reversed. Nevertheless, on the next day the schooner was sailing in the same direction. Unfortunately, for the circumstances had some gravity. A mist was beginning to come down on us. I could not keep still. My apprehensions were redoubled. It was that West was only awaiting the order to change the helm. What mortal anguish the captain's must be! I understood too well that he would not give that order without hesitation. For several days past I had not seen the half-breed, or at least I had not exchanged a word with him. He was boycotted by the whole crew, with the exception of the boatswain, who was careful to address him, although rarely got a word in return. Dirk Peters took not the faintest notice of this state of things. He remained completely absorbed in his own thoughts. Yet had he heard West give the word to steer north, I know not what acts of violence he might have been driven to. He seemed to avoid me. Was this from a desire not to compromise me? On the 17th, in the afternoon, however, Dirk Peters manifested an intention of speaking to me, and never could I have imagined what I was to learn in that interview. It was about 2:30, and, not feeling well, I had gone to my cabin, where the side window was open. That at the back was closed. I heard a knock at the door, and asked who was there. "Dirk Peters," was the reply. "You want to speak to me?" "Yes." "I'm coming out." "If you please. I should prefer... May I come into your cabin?" "Come in." He entered and shut the door behind him. Without rising I signed to him to seat himself in an arm-chair, but he remained standing. "What do you want of me, Dirk Peters?" I asked at length, as he seemed unable to make up his mind to speak. "I want to tell you something, because it seems that you should know it, and you only. In the crew they must never know it." "If it is a grave matter, and you fear any indiscretion, Dirk Peters, why do you speak to me?" "If I must, ah yes, I must. It is impossible to keep it there. It weighs on me like a stone." And Dirk Peters struck his breast violently. Then he resumed: "Yes, I am always afraid it may escape me during my sleep, and that someone will hear it, for I dream of it, and in dreaming—" "You dream?" I replied. "And of what?" "Of him, of him. Therefore it is that I sleep in corners, all alone, for fear that his true name should be discovered." Then it struck me that the half-breed was perhaps about to respond to an inquiry which I had not yet made, why he had gone to live at the Falklands under the name of Hunt after leaving Illinois. I put the question to him, and he replied: "It is not that. No, it is not that I wish. I insist, Dirk Peters, and I desire to know in the first place for what reason did you not remain in America? For what reason you chose the Falklands?" "For what reason, sir? Because I wanted to get near Pym, my poor Pym. Because I hoped to find an opportunity at the Falklands of embarking on a whaling ship bound for the Southern Sea." "But that name of Hunt?" "I would not bear my own name any longer, on account of the affair of the Grampus." The half-breed was alluding to the scene of the short straw, or lot drawing, on board the American brig, when it was decided between Augustus Barnard, Arthur Pym, Dirk Peters, and Parker the sailor, that one of the four should be sacrificed as food for the three others. I remembered the obstinate resistance of Arthur Pym, and how it was impossible for him to refuse to take the tragedy about to be performed. He says this himself, and the horrible act, whose remembrance must poison the existence of all those who had survived it. Oh, that lot drawing! The short straws were little splinters of wood of uneven length which Arthur held in his hand. The shortest was to designate him who should be immolated, and he speaks of the sort of involuntary, fierce desire to deceive his corn that he felt. To cheat is the word he uses. But he did not cheat, and he asked pardon for having had the idea. Let us try to put ourselves in his place. He made up his mind and held out his hand, closed on the 4 slips. Dirk Peters drew the first. Fate favoured him. He had nothing more to fear. Arthur Pym calculated the one more chance was against him. Augustus Barnard drew in turn. Save 2 he. And now Arthur Pym reckoned up the exact chances Parker and himself. At that moment all the ferocity, the tiger, entered into his soul. He conceived an intense and devilish hatred of his poor comrade, his fellow man. 5 minutes elapsed before Parker dared to draw. At length Arthur Pym, standing with eyes closed, not knowing whether the lot was for or against him, felt a hand seize his own. It was the hand of Dirk Peters. Arthur Pym had escaped death. And then the half-breed came upon Parker and stabbed him in the back. The frightful repast followed immediately, and words are not sufficient to convey to the mind the horror of the reality. Yes, I knew that hideous story, not a fable, as I had long believed. This was what had happened on board the Grampus on the 16th of July, 1827, and vainly did I try to understand Dirk Peters' reason for recalling it to my recollection. "Well, Dirk Peters," I said, "I will ask you, since you were anxious to hide your name, what it was that induced you to reveal it when the Halbrane was moored off Tsalal Island. Why did you not keep to the name of Hunt?" "Sir, understand me. There was hesitation about going further. They wanted to turn back. This was decided, and then I thought that by telling you who I was, Dirk Peters, of the Grampus, my poor Pym's companion, I should be heard. They would believe with me that he was still living. They would go in search of him. And yet it was a serious thing to do, to acknowledge that I was Dirk Peters, he who had killed Parker. But hunger, devouring hunger." "Come, come, Dirk Peters," said I, "you exaggerate. If the lot had fallen to you, you would have incurred the fate of Parker. You cannot be charged with a crime." "Sir, would Parker's family speak of it as you do?" "His family? Had he then relations?" "Yes, and that is why Pym changed his name in the narrative. Parker's name was not Parker, it was—" "Arthur Pym was right," I said, interrupting him quickly. "And as for me, I do not wish to know Parker's real name. Keep this secret." "No, I will tell it to you. It weighs too heavily on me, and I shall be relieved, perhaps, when I have told you, Mr. Jeorling." "No, Dirk Peters, no." "His name was Holt, Ned Holt." "Holt!" I exclaimed. "The same name as our sailing master's?" "Who is his own brother, sir." "Martin Holt?" "Yes, understand me, his brother." "But he believes that Ned Holt perished in the wreck of the Grampus with the rest." "It was not so, and if he learned that I—" Just at that instant a violent shock flung me out of my bunk. The schooner had made such a lurch to the port side that she was near foundering. I heard an angry voice cry out, "What dog is at the helm?" It was the voice of West, and the person was Hearne. I rushed out of my cabin. "Have you let the wheel go?" repeated West, who had seized Hearne by the collar of his jersey. "Lieutenant, I don't know." "Yes, I tell you, you have let it go. A little more, and the schooner would have capsized under full sail." "Gratian!" cried West, calling one of the sailors. "Take the helm, and you, Hearne, go down into the hold." On a sudden the cry of "Land!" resounded, and every eye was turned southward. End of chapter 18, part 2.